I was 30 years old, standing in a courthouse hallway that smelled of old wood and broken promises, when my ex-husband's new wife looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that I was too poor, too unstable, and frankly too pathetic to raise my own children. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on my ex-husband's arm, while I stood there in my only court-appropriate outfit. A blazer I'd found at Goodwill with a small stain I'd tried to hide with a carefully positioned scarf. I had no idea that the judge's clerk standing 3 feet away, pretending not to listen, would remember this moment a decade later when my face appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine. I had no idea that my silent, grinding determination to prove them wrong would transform me from a woman fighting for supervised visitation into the CEO of a company worth $800 million. But most of all, I had no idea that the 2 frightened children watching their mother being humiliated that day would grow up to understand exactly what I'd sacrificed, and why. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I always love seeing our global community come together. If you enjoy stories about perseverance, justice, and how a mother's love can move mountains, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these inspiring true stories. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. 3 years before that courthouse confrontation, when I was still married to a man I thought I'd spend my life with, and I had no idea how quickly everything I knew could crumble. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 27, I thought I had everything figured out. I was married to David, a successful commercial real estate developer who made more in a month than I made in a year as a middle school art teacher. We lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, had 2 incredible kids. Emma was 5 and Jake was 3. And from the outside, we looked like the perfect family. I remember standing in our kitchen one Saturday morning, watching David chase Jake around the living room while Emma painted at the kitchen table, and thinking that this was it. This was happiness. This was security. This was forever. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The late nights that became later. The business trips that seemed to multiply. The way David's phone was suddenly password protected when it never had been before. The distance that crept into his eyes when he looked at me, like he was seeing someone he used to know rather than someone he still loved. But I was busy with the kids, busy with my teaching job, busy trying to be the perfect wife and mother, and I told myself that all marriages went through phases. I told myself that once his big development project was finished, things would go back to normal. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. The truth came out on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from school because I had a migraine. I found David in our bedroom with his assistant, a 24-year-old named Melissa Chen who wore designer clothes and had the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about money a day in her life. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning a future. I heard them through the door before I opened it, talking about how David would file for divorce, how Melissa's father's law firm would handle everything, how they'd make sure David got primary custody because I was just a teacher and couldn't provide the kind of life the kids deserved. I heard Melissa laugh and say that I'd probably be relieved to have more free time, like my children were some kind of burden I'd be happy to share. I stood in that hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, my hand on the doorknob, my whole world rearranging itself into something I didn't recognize. When I finally opened the door, they didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. David just looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something important. Melissa looked at me with something close to pity, which somehow hurt worse than contempt would have. That was the moment I understood that I'd been living in a fantasy, and reality was about to hit me like a freight train. The divorce happened fast. Too fast. David's lawyer, Melissa's father, Richard Chen, who was apparently one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the state, moved with surgical precision. Within weeks, David had filed papers claiming that I was an unfit mother. Me, the woman who had given up a promising career as a professional artist to stay home with Emma when she was born. The woman who had moved across the country away from my family so David could take his dream job. The woman who had packed lunches and attended every parent-teacher conference and sat up all night when Jake had croup. Suddenly, I was unfit. Their strategy was brutal and effective. They painted me as unstable, pointing to the antidepressants I'd taken briefly after Jake's birth as evidence of mental health issues. They claimed my teaching salary wasn't sufficient to maintain the children's standard of living. They brought up every argument David and I had ever had, twisting normal marital disagreements into evidence of my volatile nature. They even suggested that my obsession with art, the fact that I sometimes painted late at night after the kids were asleep, showed that I prioritized my hobbies over my children. Richard Chen stood in that courtroom and made me sound like a monster, and I sat there in my Goodwill blazer with my court-appointed lawyer who was handling 3 other cases that same day, and I felt completely powerless. The judge was an older man named Harold Morrison who looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, but didn't stop him from ruling mostly in David's favor. I got every other weekend and 1 evening a week. David got the house, primary custody, and the ability to make all major decisions about the children's education, healthcare, and activities. I got to be a visitor in my own children's lives. I remember Emma crying and reaching for me as David led them out of the courtroom. And Melissa, who had attended the hearing even though she wasn't supposed to be there, putting her hand on Emma's shoulder like she had any right to touch my daughter. That was the first time I thought I might actually die from grief. That was the first time I understood that sometimes surviving is harder than not surviving. I moved into a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that made my mother cry when she visited. It was all I could afford on a teacher's salary after child support. Yes, I had to pay David child support, even though he made 5 times what I made, because apparently the children needed to maintain their lifestyle. The apartment had thin walls, a radiator that clanged all night, and a view of a parking lot. But it had 2 things that mattered. It was clean, and it was mine. I bought a futon that converted into a bed for when Emma and Jake visited, filled the walls with their artwork, and tried to make it feel like a home rather than a way station for broken dreams. My mother, God rest her soul, had been a single mother herself after my father died when I was 8. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and she'd always told me that the most important thing she could teach me was that a woman's worth wasn't determined by a man's opinion of her. She'd passed away 2 years before David left, but I heard her voice constantly during those early months. When I wanted to give up, when I wanted to stop fighting, when I wanted to just accept that maybe David and his expensive lawyers were right, and I really was inadequate, I heard my mother saying, "Sarah Elizabeth, you are stronger than you think. And your children are watching. Show them what strength looks like." So I started working, not just teaching, though I kept that job because it gave me health insurance and some stability. I started tutoring after school, teaching art classes at the community center on weekends when I didn't have the kids, and taking on freelance graphic design work at night. I was making barely enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and the child support payments, with nothing left over for savings or emergencies, or anything that might be considered a luxury. I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation. I cut my own hair. I learned to make meals that cost less than $5 and could stretch across 3 days. I learned what it meant to be truly poor, not just broke. And I learned that poverty is exhausting in ways that people who've never experienced it can't understand. But I also started something else. Late at night, after the tutoring and the freelance work and the lesson planning, I started developing an idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind for years. As an art teacher, I'd seen how expensive art supplies were, how many of my students couldn't afford basic materials, how schools were cutting arts programs because of budget constraints. I started researching learning about supply chains and manufacturing and distribution. I started sketching out a business plan for a company that would make high-quality, affordable art supplies accessible to schools and individual artists. I called it CreateSpace. And for the first 2 years, it existed only in notebooks I filled during my lunch breaks and in the few hours I could steal after midnight. The custody arrangement was torture. Every other Friday, I would wait outside David's house, the house that used to be mine, and watch Emma and Jake walk out with their overnight bags. Emma was 7 by then, Jake was 5, and they were starting to look at me like I was someone they used to know really well, but were slowly forgetting. David would stand in the doorway, Melissa beside him looking like she'd stepped out of a catalog, and I would feel myself shrinking. I would feel poor. I would feel inadequate. I would feel exactly like they wanted me to feel. Melissa had moved in within months of the divorce being finalized, and she'd transformed the house into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She'd redecorated Emma's room without asking me, thrown out toys I'd bought, and started referring to herself as Mommy Melissa, in a way that made my stomach turn. But worse than any of that was the way she looked at me. Every pickup, every drop-off, she would find some way to make a comment. About my car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that burned oil and had a dent in the passenger door. About my clothes, always the same rotation because I couldn't afford new ones. About my apartment, she'd never seen it, but she'd somehow found out it was in a questionable neighborhood. She never said these things in front of the kids, but she said them loud enough that they could probably hear through the door. David had changed too. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. The man I'd married had been charming and ambitious. But there had been kindness there too. Or at least I'd thought so. This version of David was cold and calculating. He used the children as weapons, subtly undermining me at every opportunity. He'd schedule important events during my custody time and then act like I was being unreasonable when I asked to switch weekends. He'd buy them expensive gifts I could never compete with. He'd take them on elaborate vacations and then make sure they told me all about it in detail. He never said I was a bad mother directly, but he created an environment where Emma and Jake couldn't help but compare our lives and find mine wanting. The worst part was watching my children slowly absorb the message that money equals love, that the parent who can provide more material things is the parent who cares more. Emma started asking why we couldn't go to Disney World like Daddy and Melissa had taken them. Jake started saying he didn't want to sleep on the futon anymore, that his real bed at Daddy's house was more comfortable. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were just children trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense. But every comment felt like a knife to the heart. I started therapy during this time, paying for it with money I probably should have spent on groceries, but I knew I couldn't survive this without help. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Wong, was a kind woman in her 60s who'd been through her own divorce and understood the specific pain of being separated from your children. She was the one who helped me understand that I needed to focus not on winning against David and Melissa, but on building something that would give me and my children a better future. She was the one who encouraged me to take my CreateSpace idea seriously, to stop treating it like a fantasy and start treating it like a plan. So I did. I took out a small business loan, using my car as collateral because I had nothing else. I found a manufacturer in China who was willing to work with my tiny order quantities. I designed packaging in my apartment at 2 a.m. I built a website using free templates and tutorials I found on YouTube. I started selling art supply kits online, targeting homeschooling parents and small schools that couldn't afford the big-name brands. The first year, I made $3,000 in profit. The second year, I made $15,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was hope. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, I could build something that mattered. But then came the custody modification hearing, 3 years after the divorce. David filed a motion to reduce my custody time even further, claiming that my multiple jobs meant I wasn't available enough for the children, and that my unstable financial situation made my home environment unsuitable. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, and I remember the weather being unseasonably cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever be warm again. I arrived at the courthouse early, wearing the same Goodwill blazer I'd worn to the divorce hearing because I still couldn't afford anything better. My lawyer was a different court-appointed attorney this time, a young woman fresh out of law school who meant well, but was clearly overwhelmed by Richard Chen's aggressive tactics. I sat on a bench in the hallway, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming, when David and Melissa arrived. Melissa was wearing a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and she walked into that courthouse like she owned it. David was beside her in an expensive suit, looking every inch the successful businessman, and they were laughing about something as they approached. They stopped laughing when they saw me, but Melissa's expression shifted into something worse than contempt. It was pity mixed with satisfaction, like she was looking at a problem that had finally been solved. That's when she said it. We were standing in the hallway, other people milling around, waiting for various hearings to begin, and Melissa looked at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know, Sarah, I really think this is for the best. The children need stability, and you're just too poor, too unstable, and frankly too pathetic to give them what they need. Maybe if you'd focused less on your little art hobby and more on building an actual career, things would be different. But you made your choices, and now you have to live with them." I felt every eye in that hallway turn toward me. I felt the heat rising in my face, the tears threatening to spill over, the humiliation washing over me like a wave. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her that I worked 3 jobs while she spent David's money and played house with my children. I wanted to tell her that my little art hobby was actually a growing business that I was building from nothing with no help from anyone. I wanted to tell her that being poor didn't make me a bad mother, that loving my children and fighting for them every single day made me a good mother, regardless of my bank account balance. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there, frozen, while Melissa smiled her perfect smile, and David looked uncomfortable but said nothing to defend me. I just stood there while other people pretended not to stare, while my lawyer looked horrified but helpless, while the world seemed to confirm everything I'd been afraid of, that maybe they were right, maybe I really was inadequate, maybe I really was too poor and too pathetic to deserve my own children. Then I noticed the judge's clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, standing a few feet away. She'd been organizing files, but she'd stopped, and she was looking at Melissa with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't approval. It wasn't even neutral. It was something closer to disgust, quickly masked by professional courtesy. She caught my eye for just a second, and something passed between us. Recognition, maybe, or understanding, or just the acknowledgement that she'd witnessed something cruel and unnecessary. The hearing itself was a nightmare. Richard Chen painted me as a woman who couldn't keep a stable job, who was constantly scrambling for money, who lived in a substandard apartment in a questionable neighborhood. He brought up every late child support payment, never mentioning that I'd always paid, just sometimes a few days late. He questioned my decision to start a business, suggesting it showed poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. He made my determination to build something better sound like delusion, and my hard work sound like... Judge Morrison listened to everything, his expression unreadable. When it was my lawyer's turn, she did her best, but we had so little to work with. Yes, I had multiple jobs, but that showed work ethic, not instability. Yes, I lived in a modest apartment, but it was clean and safe and filled with love. Yes, I'd started a small business, but it was growing and showed initiative. We had numbers, we had character witnesses, we had evidence that Emma and Jake were happy during our time together. But it all felt thin compared to David's expensive lawyers and Melissa's designer clothes and the overwhelming evidence that they could provide material things I couldn't. The judge ruled that my custody time would remain the same, every other weekend and one evening a week. But he added a provision that any future business ventures had to be approved by the court to ensure they didn't interfere with my parenting time. It felt like a slap. Like even trying to improve my situation was being treated as suspicious. David and Melissa left the courthouse looking satisfied. I left feeling like I'd been hollowed out, like there was nothing left inside me but determination and rage, and a love for my children so fierce it hurt to breathe. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a decision. I couldn't control what David and Melissa did. I couldn't control what judges decided or what lawyers argued. But I could control my own actions. I could work harder. I could build bigger. I could prove, not just to them but to myself and to my children, that worth isn't measured in bank accounts and designer clothes. I could show Emma and Jake that their mother was strong, that she never gave up, that she fought for them every single day, even when the world told her she wasn't enough. So I worked. God, I worked. I kept teaching because I needed the stability and the health insurance, but I poured every other minute into CreateSpace. I woke up at 5 a.m. to answer customer emails before school. I spent my lunch breaks on calls with manufacturers and suppliers. I spent my evenings after tutoring building the website, improving products, researching markets. I spent the nights when I didn't have Emma and Jake working until 2 or 3 a.m, surviving on coffee and determination and the image of Melissa's smug face in that courthouse hallway. CreateSpace started growing faster than I'd ever imagined. The art supply kits I'd designed were genuinely good. High quality but affordable. Thoughtfully curated for different skill levels and age groups. Teachers loved them. Homeschooling parents loved them. Individual artists loved them. I started getting orders from schools, then from school districts, then from educational supply companies who wanted to distribute my products. Within a year, I'd hired my first employee, a college student who helped with packing and shipping. Within 2 years, I'd hired 5 more and moved operations out of my apartment into a small warehouse space. The money started coming in. Slowly at first, then faster. I paid off the business loan. I started paying myself a small salary on top of my teaching income. I moved into a better apartment, a 2-bedroom place in a safer neighborhood where Emma and Jake could each have their own space when they visited. I bought a newer car, nothing fancy, but something reliable that didn't burn oil or have dents. I started being able to buy groceries without checking my bank account first. Started being able to take Emma and Jake to the movies or out for pizza without calculating whether I could afford it. But I didn't tell David. I didn't tell Melissa. I didn't tell anyone except Dr. Wong and my small team of employees. I kept teaching, kept living modestly, kept showing up to custody exchanges in my old clothes and my old car. Part of it was fear. Fear that if David knew I was making money, he'd find some way to take it or use it against me. Part of it was strategy. I knew that if I was going to truly change my situation, I needed to build something undeniable, something so successful that no one could dismiss it as a little art hobby. But mostly, it was determination. I wanted to prove something, not just to them, but to myself. I wanted to know that I could do this, that I could build something meaningful from nothing, that I could be more than what they'd told me I was. Emma and Jake were 10 and 8 by then, old enough to start asking questions about why Mommy worked so much, why I was always on my laptop during our time together. I tried to explain it in ways they could understand. I told them I was building something special, something that would help other kids like them make art. I told them that sometimes grown-ups have to work hard to make good things happen. I told them I loved them more than anything in the world, and everything I did was for them. I don't know how much they understood. I don't know how much they believed me. But I kept trying, kept showing up, kept being present, even when I was exhausted. David and Melissa got married in a lavish ceremony when Emma was 9. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Emma and Jake told me all about it. The beautiful venue, the expensive flowers, the fancy cake, Melissa's designer wedding dress. Jake, in his innocent 8-year-old way, asked me why I hadn't had a wedding like that when I married Daddy. I told him that different people have different kinds of weddings, and the important thing wasn't how much money you spent, but how much you loved each other. He seemed satisfied with that answer, but Emma, who was older and more perceptive, looked at me with something like pity, and I realized that she was starting to internalize the same messages Melissa had been feeding her, that money equals worth, that expensive things equal love. That was the moment I knew I had to accelerate my timeline. CreateSpace was doing well, but I needed it to do better. I needed to build something so undeniably successful that even my children couldn't dismiss it, something that would show them that their mother wasn't pathetic, or poor, or inadequate. I started working with a business consultant, using money I'd saved to hire someone who could help me scale. We developed a 5-year growth plan. We identified new markets. We started developing new product lines. We began the process of seeking investors who could help us expand nationally. The next 5 years were a blur of work and sacrifice and determination. I finally quit teaching, which was bittersweet because I loved my students. But I needed to focus full-time on CreateSpace if I was going to make it everything I knew it could be. We grew from 6 employees to 30, then to 100. We moved into a proper office building with a real warehouse. We started selling in major retail stores. We developed partnerships with schools across the country. We launched an online platform where teachers could share lesson plans and students could showcase their work. CreateSpace became more than just a business. It became a movement. A community of people who believed that art education mattered and should be accessible to everyone. My relationship with Emma and Jake evolved during this time. They were teenagers by then, old enough to have their own opinions about the divorce, about their parents, about their lives. Emma, who was 15, had become quieter, more withdrawn. She spent most of her time at David and Melissa's house, and when she was with me, she seemed to be counting the hours until she could leave. It broke my heart, but I tried to give her space, tried to let her know I was there whenever she needed me. Jake, who was 13, was more open, more willing to engage. He'd started showing an interest in business, asking me questions about CreateSpace, wanting to understand how I'd built it. Those conversations were some of the best moments of my life. My son, seeing me not as poor or pathetic, but as someone who'd created something meaningful. David's real estate business had its ups and downs during this time. He'd made some risky investments that hadn't paid off, and while he was still wealthy by most standards, he wasn't as flush as he'd been during the divorce. Melissa had stopped working entirely after they got married, focusing instead on charity events and social climbing and maintaining their image. I heard through mutual acquaintances that their marriage wasn't as perfect as it looked from the outside, that David was stressed about money, that Melissa was demanding and high maintenance. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles exactly, but I won't lie and say I didn't feel a certain satisfaction knowing that money hadn't bought them happiness. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was 40 years old, 10 years after that humiliating scene in the courthouse hallway, when my business consultant told me it was time to consider taking CreateSpace public. We'd grown to the point where we needed significant capital to continue expanding, and an initial public offering would give us that capital while also allowing me to realize the value of what I'd built. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely surreal. The girl who'd stood in that courthouse in a Goodwill blazer, being told she was too poor to raise her own children, was about to ring the opening bell at the stock exchange. The process of going public took months of preparation. There were lawyers and accountants and investment bankers. There were audits and filings and presentations to potential investors. There were long nights and stressful days and moments when I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. But through it all, I kept thinking about Emma and Jake. I kept thinking about the message I wanted to send them, that hard work matters, that determination matters, that being counted out doesn't mean you're actually out. The day CreateSpace went public was a Thursday in June. The stock was priced at $18 per share, and we were offering 10 million shares. I owned 60% of the company, which meant that on paper, I was suddenly worth over $100 million. The number was so absurd, so disconnected from my reality, that I couldn't quite process it. I stood on the floor of the stock exchange, surrounded by my team, watching the stock price tick up as trading began, and I felt like I was watching someone else's life. But the real moment, the moment that mattered, came 2 days later when Forbes published an article about CreateSpace and its unlikely founder, a former middle school art teacher who'd built an $800 million company from her living room. The article included my photo, a professional headshot that showed a confident, successful businesswoman who looked nothing like the broken, humiliated woman from that courthouse hallway. The article told my story: the divorce, the custody battle, the struggle to make ends meet, the determination to build something meaningful. It didn't name David or Melissa, but anyone who knew me would know exactly who the article was talking about when it mentioned my ex-husband and his new wife. The article went viral. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, picked up by other news outlets, discussed on business podcasts and morning shows. I started getting interview requests, speaking invitations, messages from people who'd been inspired by my story. It was overwhelming and exhausting and wonderful all at once. But the only thing I really cared about was whether Emma and Jake would see it, and what they would think. I didn't have to wait long. Emma called me that Saturday morning, which was unusual because she rarely initiated contact. Her voice was strange when I answered, tight with emotion I couldn't identify. She said, "Mom, I saw the article, the one in Forbes. Is it true?" Is all of that true? I told her yes, it was true. I told her that CreateSpace was real, that I'd been building it for years, that I'd kept it quiet because I wanted to focus on the work rather than the attention. I told her that everything I'd done, every hour I'd worked, every sacrifice I'd made, had been for her and Jake. I told her that I loved her more than anything in the world, and I was sorry if my work had made her feel neglected or unimportant, because she was the most important thing in my life. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Emma said in a voice that broke my heart, "Mom, Melissa showed me the article this morning. She was laughing about it, saying it was probably exaggerated, saying you probably paid someone to write it to make yourself look good." But then Dad looked it up, and he saw the stock price, and he saw the company valuation, and his face just went white. He didn't say anything, but Melissa started freaking out, saying there was no way you could have built something like that you must have had help or gotten lucky or something. And I just stood there listening to them, and I realized that I'd believed them. I'd believed that you were less than, that you were struggling, that you were somehow not as good as they were. And I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I was crying by then, sitting in my apartment, a beautiful 2-bedroom place in a good neighborhood that I could now easily afford, but hadn't upgraded because I'd been focused on the business, and listening to my daughter apologize for believing the lies that had been fed to her for years. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she was a child caught in an impossible situation, that I understood, and I forgave her, and I loved her. I told her that the only thing that mattered now was moving forward, building a relationship based on honesty and trust and love. Jake called an hour later. his 13-year-old voice full of excitement and pride. He'd seen the article too, and he'd immediately understood what it meant. He said, "Mom, you're like a superhero. You were working all those jobs and building this huge company and you never said anything. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell everyone?" I explained to him that I'd needed to focus on the work, that I'd needed to prove to myself that I could do it, that I'd wanted to build something real and lasting rather than just talk about building it. I told him that success isn't about announcing your plans, it's about executing them. I told him that I hoped he'd learned something from watching me, that setbacks don't define you, that other people's opinions don't determine your worth, that hard work and determination can overcome almost anything. But the real reckoning came the following Tuesday when I had to drop Jake off at David's house after our custody weekend. I pulled up in my new car, nothing ostentatious, just a reliable SUV that was appropriate for a successful businesswoman. And I was wearing clothes that actually fit properly and looked professional because I could finally afford a real wardrobe. I walked up to the door with Jake, and David answered, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite fear, but it was close. It was the look of a man who'd realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. Melissa appeared behind him, and her face was even more revealing. All the smugness, all the superiority, all the contempt that had characterized her expression for years was gone, replaced by something that looked like panic and confusion and disbelief. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time, like the poor, pathetic woman she'd mocked in that courthouse hallway had been replaced by someone else entirely. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, letting them look at me, letting them process what they were seeing. Then I said, very calmly, very quietly, "I'm here to discuss modifying our custody arrangement. I think it's time Emma and Jake had more say in where they spend their time, don't you?" David's face went even paler. He knew what I was implying. He knew that I now had the resources to hire the best lawyers, to fight for equal custody or even primary custody if I wanted to. He knew that the financial arguments that had been used against me for years were now completely irrelevant. He knew that the power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that there was no going back. Melissa started to say something, but David put his hand on her arm, stopping her. He said, "Sarah, can we talk? Inside? Without the kids?" I told Jake to wait in the car, and I followed David and Melissa into the house that used to be mine. We sat in the living room that Melissa had redecorated, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. Then David said, "I saw the Forbes article. I looked up your company. I had no idea. Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at him. This man I'd once loved. This man who'd betrayed me and humiliated me and used our children as weapons. And I felt nothing but pity. I said, "Why would I tell you? So you could try to take it from me? So you could use it as evidence that I was prioritizing work over our children? So Melissa could mock my little art hobby some more? I didn't tell you because it was none of your business. I built CreateSpace for me and for Emma and Jake. I built it to prove to myself that I was worth more than you told me I was. And I succeeded." Melissa finally found her voice. She said, "You can't just come in here and demand changes to the custody arrangement. There are rules. There are procedures." I cut her off. I said, "You're right. There are rules and procedures. And I now have the resources to navigate those rules and procedures with the best legal team money can buy. But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to propose something reasonable. Emma is 15, Jake is 13. They're old enough to have a voice in where they spend their time. I'm proposing that we move to a more flexible arrangement where they can choose, with the understanding that I want equal time, but I'm willing to let them decide how that time is structured." David looked relieved, like he'd expected me to come in demanding full custody and threatening legal warfare. He said, "That seems reasonable. I think we can work with that." But Melissa wasn't done. She said, her voice sharp with desperation, "This is ridiculous. You can't just buy your way into being a better mother. Money doesn't change who you are. You're still the same person who couldn't afford to take care of her own children. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw what she was. A woman who'd built her entire identity on being better than me, who'd spent years using my poverty as proof of her superiority, who was now facing the reality that the foundation of her self-worth had crumbled. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I said, "You're absolutely right, Melissa. Money doesn't change who I am. I'm the same person I was 10 years ago when you mocked me in that courthouse hallway. I'm the same person who worked 3 jobs to support my children. I'm the same person who gave up sleep and comfort and security to build something meaningful. The difference is that now everyone can see what I've always known, that worth isn't measured in bank accounts, or designer clothes, or expensive houses. It's measured in character and determination and love. I've always had those things. You've never had them at all." The silence that followed was profound. David looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. Melissa looked like she'd been slapped. And I felt, for the first time in 10 years, completely at peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was just done. I stood up to leave and David said, "Sarah, wait. I owe you an apology. For everything. For the affair, for the divorce, for the custody battle, for not defending you when Melissa said those things. I was a coward, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I looked at him, and I could see that he meant it. I could see the regret in his eyes, the understanding that he'd thrown away something valuable for something that had turned out to be hollow. I said, "I appreciate that, David, but I don't need your apology. I needed it 10 years ago, and you didn't give it to me. I don't need it anymore. I've moved on." Over the next few months, the custody arrangement did change. Emma, who was now old enough to really understand what had happened, chose to spend more time with me. She apologized repeatedly for believing Melissa's narrative, for treating me like I was less than, for not seeing what I was building. I told her over and over that she had nothing to apologize for, that children shouldn't have to navigate their parents' conflicts, that I loved her unconditionally. We started rebuilding our relationship, slowly and carefully. And it was painful and beautiful all at once. Jake, who'd always been more open to me, was thrilled with the new arrangement. He started spending equal time at both houses, and he began working with me at CreateSpace during the summers, learning about business and leadership and what it meant to build something from nothing. Watching him grow into a thoughtful, ambitious young man who valued hard work and integrity was one of the greatest joys of my life. David and Melissa's marriage deteriorated over the following years. The financial stress from David's business struggles, combined with the loss of Melissa's sense of superiority over me, created cracks that eventually became chasms. They divorced when Emma was 17, and while I didn't take pleasure in their pain, I won't pretend I didn't see the irony. Melissa, who'd spent years defining herself as better than me because she'd married a wealthy man, was now facing the same situation I'd faced. Single, starting over, trying to figure out who she was without someone else's success to prop her up. CreateSpace continued to grow. We expanded internationally, developed new product lines, created programs that brought art education to underserved communities around the world. I used my platform to advocate for arts funding in schools, to support young entrepreneurs, to tell my story in ways that might inspire others who felt counted out or overlooked. I gave speeches at business conferences, wrote articles about resilience and determination, and tried to use my success to create opportunities for others. But the most meaningful moment came 2 years after the Forbes article. At Emma's high school graduation. She'd been accepted to her dream college with a full scholarship, and she'd decided to study business with a focus on social entrepreneurship. During her valedictorian speech, she talked about her mother, about a woman who'd faced impossible odds and refused to give up, who'd worked 3 jobs while building a company that would change lives, who'd shown her that strength isn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every single time. I sat in that audience, surrounded by other parents, and I cried. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of joy and gratitude and overwhelming pride. My daughter saw me. After years of believing I was less than, she finally saw me for who I really was. And in that moment, I knew that everything I'd been through, every humiliation and setback and sleepless night, had been worth it. 10 years after that courthouse confrontation, I'm 50 years old and the CEO of a company worth over $1 billion. I have a beautiful relationship with both of my children. I have a career that gives me purpose and allows me to make a real difference in the world. I have financial security and professional respect and personal fulfillment. But more than any of that, I have something that Melissa's mocking words in that courthouse hallway tried to take from me. I have the absolute certainty that I am enough, that I've always been enough, that my worth was never determined by my bank account, or my ex-husband's opinion, or anyone else's judgment. I still think about that day sometimes. About standing in that courthouse hallway feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. I think about the judge's clerk who witnessed Melissa's cruelty and remembered it years later when my success became public. I think about all the people who underestimated me, who dismissed me, who counted me out. And I think about how wrong they were, and how right my mother was when she told me that a woman's worth isn't determined by a man's opinion of her. Because here's what I learned through all of this. Being poor doesn't make you pathetic. Struggling doesn't make you weak. Working multiple jobs doesn't make you unstable. Facing setbacks doesn't make you a failure. What makes you pathetic is mocking someone who's down. What makes you weak is using money as a weapon. What makes you unstable is building your identity on being better than someone else. What makes you a failure is giving up on your values in pursuit of comfort. I didn't build CreateSpace to get revenge on David and Melissa, though I won't lie and say their dismissal didn't fuel my determination. I built it because I believed in the mission, because I wanted to make art education accessible, because I wanted to show my children what perseverance looks like, and because I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of more than the world told me I was. The fact that my success also vindicated me in the eyes of people who doubted me was just a bonus. A satisfying but ultimately unimportant side effect of doing the work that mattered. Today, when I drop Emma and Jake off at their father's house, which happens less frequently now that they're both in college, but still occasionally during breaks, I don't feel small anymore. I don't feel inadequate or poor or pathetic. I feel proud of what I've built, grateful for the journey that got me here, and at peace with who I've become. David treats me with respect now, sometimes even with admiration. Melissa, who I rarely see anymore, treats me with careful politeness that barely masks her discomfort. And my children, my beautiful, brilliant children, treat me with love and respect and pride. The judge's clerk, whose name I later learned was Margaret Sullivan, reached out to me after the Forbes article was published. She told me that she'd never forgotten that day in the courthouse, that she'd been disgusted by Melissa's behavior and moved by my quiet dignity, and that she'd followed my success with joy and satisfaction. She told me that in her 30 years working in family court, she'd seen countless women dismissed and underestimated, and that my story gave her hope that justice, even if it takes time, eventually prevails. We've become friends, and she's now on the board of CreateSpace's charitable foundation, helping us direct resources to families going through difficult divorces and custody battles. So what an incredible journey I took from that courthouse hallway to the cover of Forbes magazine, from a woman fighting for supervised visitation to the CEO of $1 billion company. My story reminds us that true worth comes from character, not circumstances. That determination can overcome almost any obstacle, and that the people who count you out are often the ones who end up being proven spectacularly wrong. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have had the strength to keep working, keep building, keep believing in yourself when everyone around you was telling you that you weren't enough? Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed because of your circumstances? Share your story in the comments below. Do you know someone who's shown incredible resilience in the face of adversity? Tell us about them. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that your current circumstances don't determine your ultimate worth, that hard work and determination can transform your life, and that the people who mock you today might be the ones humbled by your success tomorrow, please show your support by hitting that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories about real people whose courage and perseverance changed their lives. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.